Hey, Soul Stories fam. We're starting a new love journey. Tell us where you're watching from. Don't forget to subscribe and join our family. Now stay with us. The story begins. Candlelight shimmered across the white tablecloth, utensils clinked lightly, and the smell of buttery garlic from steaming pasta drifted through the air. Belmaro was fully booked tonight. Couples whispered in soft, silky tones. Businessmen in suits leaned over peaceful negotiations. Everything felt warm, elegant, and calm, except for table 7. Tessa sat small and folded into her chair, hands clasped tightly in her lap, as if she were trying to stop them from shaking. Her head was lowered, brown hair falling to one side to hide half her face. The bruise on her jawbone had been covered with foundation, but the warm yellow lighting still revealed a faint, throbbing violet underneath. "Could I try the gnocchi?" she asked quietly, forcing her voice to stay steady. Troy didn't answer. He was scrolling through his phone, lips curled in that way that made everything around him seem like nothing more than a backdrop for his greatness. Tessa inhaled slowly. "Don't upset him," she reminded herself. "Don't slip. Don't make a mistake. Don't—" Her hand moved too fast. Her finger bumped the wine glass, sending it off balance, tipping right. Crash! Red wine splattered across the pristine white tablecloth like spreading blood. A few drops hit Troy's wrist. He froze for half a second. Then his face shifted to the color of a storm. Tessa jerked so hard her entire chair shook. The reflex came faster than awareness, the reflex of someone who had been hit many times, even in public places. "I'm sorry. I didn't mean—" she stammered, hands trembling so badly her fork slipped and clattered onto the floor. He leaned in, lips barely moving so only she could hear, but enough for a cold chill to slice straight down her spine. "You're dead when we get home." The words were soft as a breeze, yet they squeezed the air from her lungs. At the next table, a man working on his laptop paused. Parker Technologies glowed across the screen. Julian Parker, rolled sleeve blue shirt, silver steel watch, was reading a report. But the sentence "you're dead when we get home" landed squarely in his ears. A beat later, his expression darkened. A flashback hit, fast, sharp, merciless. His mother in their old kitchen when he was 8. A loud slap. The sound of dishes breaking. His mother's teary eyes, her hand shielding her cheek, whispering, "It's okay, sweetheart. I'm fine." He knew that expression on Tessa's face. He'd seen it all through his childhood. Julian lifted his head, watching. His hand tightened around his water glass until his knuckles whitened. Meanwhile, Troy leaned forward as if whispering something sweet. Under the table, his hand slid down and clamped viciously around Tessa's wrist, so hard she nearly lost her breath. The bolt of pain made Tessa bite her lip until it bled. She tried not to let anyone see, tried to keep her skin quiet, tried to push the pain inward instead of letting it escape. "Troy, you're hurting me," she murmured. He smiled politely as if complimenting the meal. "If you open your mouth again, I'll snap your fingers. Sit still." Tessa lowered her head further. Her hand shook so violently that even the napkin trembled with it. "I'm sorry," she repeated, voice barely a breath. "I'm sorry. It was my fault." It wasn't an apology. It was survival. A server rushed over, flustered. Troy immediately changed tone. "It's fine. My girlfriend's a bit clumsy. She'll cover the cleaning fee." Tessa bowed her head low. "I'm sorry. I'll pay." Julian watched this unfold, eyes turning dark and heavy. Not because of momentary anger, because it was too familiar. He had witnessed scenes like this countless times while living in shelters with his mother, women apologizing for nothing, just to make it through the night. Tessa's wrist was still trapped under the table. Her nails pressed so hard into her skin they were leaving dents. She whispered, "Troy, it hurts." He ground his teeth. "Shut up. I don't want anyone looking over here." Tessa's face drained of color. Her eyes glistened. A single tear fell onto the white cloth. She tried to hide it. Julian braced his hands on his table, jaw tight. He couldn't do anything. But he also couldn't intervene yet. Not when Troy was on the edge of exploding. Not when Tessa was clearly terrified, barely able to breathe. Julian felt his throat dry out. He squeezed his glass, hard, until veins rose along the back of his hand. He couldn't stay silent. Not tonight. Not when a woman was trembling just a few feet away. He opened his wallet, pulled out a business card, one he rarely gave to anyone. His thumb brushed the rigid edge. His eyes returned to Tessa. Her gaze was downcast, but the hand hidden beneath the table trembled in a rhythm like a strangled heartbeat. Julian set his wallet down, inhaled deeply, and made a decision. Tonight he would act. Troy set the knife down, wiped his mouth with a napkin, then stood up and spoke to Tessa in a tightly contained voice only the two of them could hear. Go to the restroom, sit still, don't make trouble. He walked away, the click of his shoes on the dark wood floor blending into the gentle piano music. But the moment his back disappeared through the door, Tessa nearly collapsed into her chair, fingers gripping the tablecloth so hard her knuckles turned white. She tried to steady her breath, keep her face neutral, pretend nothing was happening. But someone had noticed. Someone had seen everything. Julian stood up, not because of impulse, not because he wanted to play hero, but if he stayed seated, he'd be punishing the child he once was. The boy who watched his mother get hurt and couldn't do a thing. He walked toward Tessa's table, each step slow, controlled, silent, until he was standing beside her. Tessa flinched, eyes wide like a trapped animal cornered by danger. Sorry, she stammered instinctively, as if anyone who approached her was a threat. Julian lifted a hand slightly, a gesture telling her he wouldn't touch her, wouldn't startle her further. His voice was low, deep, softened through layers as if wrapped in fabric just to make sure it wouldn't hurt her more. I'm sorry to bother you. A breath later, he spoke even softer. So soft only the two of them could hear, so soft no one around them could sense anything was happening. I heard what he said to you, and I know men like him. If you ever need help, even once, I can help. Tessa froze as if stabbed. She shook her head, fear rising so fast her chest heaved. You misunderstand. It's not like that. Troy, Julian didn't let her force another lie out of terror, didn't make her defend the man who deserved handcuffs. He gently set a business card down beside her water glass. The motion slow, impossibly light, like any stronger force might break her. No need to explain. His voice stayed deep, steady. No pity, only the kindness of someone who had lived in darkness and now recognized another darkness swallowing someone whole. Just remember, if the day comes when you want to leave this life, he paused, his eyes catching the faint bruise on her wrist where Troy had grabbed her. Call this number, I'll come, no matter what time it is. Tessa stared at the card like it was an escape route, but one so terrifying she could barely breathe. A tear escaped. She wiped it away fast, terrified that even a tear might betray her. You don't understand. If Troy finds out, Julian answered quietly, though every muscle in his body had tensed. I understand more than you think. In that brief second, Tessa saw an old wound in his eyes, a pain not hers, yet frighteningly similar. The restroom door opened. Troy stepped out. Julian moved back, slipping into the role of a harmless stranger so perfectly that Troy would never suspect a thing. He nodded once to Tessa, his eyes reminding her, hold on to this chance. When you're ready. Tessa dropped her gaze, hiding the card between her trembling hands. They left the restaurant and got into the car. The door slammed shut, the automatic lock clicking like a cell door ceiling. Troy grabbed Tessa's wrist, right over the bruise, and yanked her into the seat. Don't blame me when you don't buckle up, he growled. The car shot forward into the dark. Streetlights streaked across Tessa's tear-rimmed eyes like broken beams of hope. He squeezed her wrist so hard the blood nearly stopped, leaning in, voice low like a predator, barely restraining the urge to rip its prey apart. You'll pay for this when we get home. No one outside the car heard. No one but them understood. No one was coming to save her. The apartment reeked of old cigarettes and the cologne Troy sprayed on his collar. Tessa didn't even have time to remove her coat before. Smack! The first slap. Not hard, not to knock her down, just enough to assert control. You spilled a drink in front of everyone. You embarrassed me, Troy said calmly, like discussing business. Tessa reeled, hand on her cheek, but didn't cry. She was used to this, because this wasn't the first time. The bruise on her wrist wasn't healed. The mark at the back of her neck still throbbed, the faint blue stain under her right rib, from a kick 2 weeks ago. Tessa stood there silent, a shadow of herself. Troy shoved her onto the couch. Next time, I'll hit harder. He turned off the living room lights, walked into the bedroom, shut the door, letting the darkness swallow the place like a bottomless pit. Tessa walked into the bathroom, closed the door, switched on the faint yellow light, so dim it seemed close to dying. She faced the mirror, a fresh red mark on her left cheek. Finger-shaped shadows pressed into her skin, eyes dark from fear and sleepless nights. She slipped off her coat, the bruise around her wrist dark, each of his fingers imprinted like a claim. Old marks, new marks. Her body is a map of violence. She opened her bag, heart pounding so hard her ears rang. She pulled out the stiff white card she had shoved into her purse while leaving the restaurant. The name Julian Parker, a phone number, no logo, no address, just a lifeline resting in her palm. Tessa shook violently. Her fingertip brushed the card's edge. That tiny touch nearly made her break down. But then, a voice echoed in her head. Troy's voice from the night she tried to run, and he caught her at the door. If you ever leave me, I'll go after your friends. I'll go after your mom. I'll kill every one of them. Tessa squeezed the card so hard it bent. A tear dropped onto the sink. No, 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 she whispered, shaking. She put the card back into her bag, but her hand kept trembling, as if it no longer belonged to her. That night she didn't sleep. She just sat curled in the dark, staring at the closed bedroom door, clutching her aching arm, hoping Troy would wake in a better mood tomorrow. But deep inside that trembling body, a tiny, fragile fragment, hoped for something else. Hoped that someday she would dare to call that number. The next morning didn't arrive with sunlight. It arrived with the numb, burning throb on the left side of her face, a deep ache like someone had lit a cold flame under her skin. Tessa opened her eyes in that brief moment abuse victims often experience. The moment when they forget the night before and think they've woken up in a normal life until memory comes crashing back like a black wave. Her whole body locked up. Her heart pounded so hard it nearly strangled her breath. Tessa was no exception. She lay still, afraid to move, listening to the smallest sound from Troy's bedroom, the way someone listens to a bomb's countdown. She sat up slowly, as if even her own breathing might anger someone. The kitchen was still cold, its dim yellow light too weak to melt the thin tremor in her fingertips. Tessa was trying to make tea, hands still shaking, when Troy walked out in a crisp white shirt, expensive cologne trailing behind him. What terrified her most wasn't the footsteps or the long shadow he cast across the floor. It was the smile he wore, sweet, calm, gentle enough to convince anyone that nothing had happened last night. "You're up?" he asked lightly, as if he hadn't slapped her the night before, as if he hadn't squeezed her wrist purple, as if the threat, "You're dead when we get home," had come from someone else entirely. Tessa didn't speak. She only nodded, the exact kind of nod he liked, small, obedient, unchallenging, nothing that might offend him. Troy took a sip of coffee and said in a voice so soft it sent a cold ripple down her spine, "Last night I just got a little heated. You know me. I love you. I just lost face at the restaurant." Just that single word sliced across her like a thin blade. "Yes," she whispered, her voice barely more than a breath. He brushed her hair as gently as a lover's kiss, yet even that soft touch made the bruised skin beneath it flare with pain. Then he headed to the door, tying his shoes, putting on his coat, leaving without turning back. "I'll be home early," he said, and closed the door. Silence filled the apartment again, but it wasn't ordinary silence. It was the kind that thickened the air, pressing down until Tessa collapsed into the chair, as though every force keeping her upright had left with him. She lay there and drifted into sleep without meaning to. She didn't know how long she slept before a violent nightmare slammed into her. She jolted awake. It was already noon. Her hands shook. Sweat beaded on her skin. She sat for a moment until her trembling eased, then pushed herself up and walked to the bathroom. And when the white light hit the mirror, she stopped breathing. A swollen patch of purple red blossomed on her left cheek, the purple of humiliation, the red of pain. And under the light, it glowed like a mark that couldn't be denied. She raised a finger to touch it, just a graze, and tears spilled instantly, uncontrollably. Not just from pain, but because she realized he'd gone further than she ever imagined last night, and this morning he had acted tenderly, as if everything had been her fault. Tessa turned the lights brighter to see clearly. She saw the older bruises on her wrist, Troy's fingers stamped in 4 dark marks. On her right rib, there is a fading greenish patch from his kick 3 weeks ago. Her body looked like a map of a life carved by cruelty. She opened her purse and saw Julian's business card lying there. Still, quiet, but radiating a faint warmth of hope. She didn't think. She simply called. Her fingers shook so violently that she almost dialed the wrong number twice. The phone rang, once, twice, 3 times. "Julian speaking." Tessa couldn't form a word. Only broken, rapid breaths came out. "Tessa, right. If you're in danger, don't speak. Just let me hear you breathe." She inhaled shakily, just once. Julian understood everything. "Is this an SOS call?" She bit her lip until it bled, then whispered like surrender. Yes." And instantly, Julian's voice changed. It was no longer the voice of a stranger sitting at the next table last night. It was the voice of someone who had seen the darkness, had been torn by it, and had vowed never to leave anyone inside it alone. "All right, from this moment, you don't have to survive by yourself. Listen to me, Tessa. We're getting you out today." Tessa broke, silent sobs racking her chest as if her lungs were being squeezed but still fighting to breathe. Julian didn't interrupt, didn't ask questions, didn't demand explanations. He spoke like someone coordinating a rescue team. "I'm calling security now. A car will pick you up at the back entrance, where Troy won't look. I'll arrange a safe apartment for you. I'm also contacting a lawyer to file an emergency restraining order." Tessa clutched her chest, fighting to breathe, fighting not to collapse. "Julian, I'm scared." Julian heard every tremor. He paused a tight, aching second, then answered in a voice low enough to wrap around her like a blanket. "I know, and I'm here. Tessa, you've endured enough. Now it's my turn to take care of you." She gripped the phone, clinging to it like the edge of a cliff. For the first time in years, she didn't feel alone in the dark. "In 30 minutes, he continued, my people will be at the back door of your building. When you hear 3 knocks, only 3, you open the door and go, 'Don't look back. Don't take anything heavy. Don't speak to anyone.'" Tessa nodded even though he couldn't see. Tears fell onto her lips, salty and warm. Julian added slow and steady, "Tessa, from this moment on, you're no longer alone." And that sentence, just that one sentence, saved her from the death Troy had promised the night before. The small apartment was drowned in a dim light, like a moment suspended between day and night, between hope and despair, between life and death. And Tessa stood in the living room, with legs so weak they could barely hold her up, still holding the phone Julian had just hung up. Her heart pounding wildly like a caged bird suddenly seeing a sliver of light beyond the bars. She looked around the familiar apartment, but tonight it was no longer the place she once called home. It felt more like a cage, where every corner held traces of arguments that never ended, where the pillow still carried Troy's cologne like a warning, where a glass beneath the sink still bore the crack he caused the last time he lost his temper. And Tessa felt as if every item in the apartment was watching her, asking whether this time she had enough courage to walk out, or whether she would break and crawl back as she had before. She drew in a long, steadying breath, trying to keep her hands from shaking, then opened the closet to grab her handbag. But her fingers froze when she saw the gray t-shirt Troy liked her to wear. It once made her feel cute. Now it only reminded her of the night he squeezed her throat until air vanished. She pulled her hand back like she'd been burned, closed her eyes and told herself, "Only take what you need. Only what you need." Julian had said not to bring much, not to make a sound, not to leave signs. Tessa bent down and opened the bottom drawer, pulling out a slim wallet, a clean pair of socks, and the small business card she had tucked carefully into the inside pocket of her coat. The one thing that made her feel she was touching a lifeline in the dark. As she zipped the small bag shut, the faint rasp of the zipper made her gasp and slap a hand to her chest, her heart threatening to leap free. She listened. The hallway outside was silent. The apartment upstairs had a TV playing, a window somewhere shut against the wind. No Troy, at least not yet. Tessa approached the window, lifting the curtain just slightly to peer down at the right corner of the building. She spotted a black SUV in the parking lot. She didn't know if it was Julian's car, but instinct told her he had arrived early, as if he knew she might freeze or panic and lose her nerve. But before she could cling to that hope, the elevator chimed softly. She went still. Her eyes widened. Air froze in her lungs. The sound was ordinary, harmless. But in her ears it rang like a death knell. He was home, and if he saw her packing... She didn't allow the thought to finish. She backed away, pressing herself against the door, hand covering her mouth to stop the sob rising in her throat. Footsteps. Heavy, steady, slow. No, no, no. Please don't be him. Please don't be him. Tessa collapsed to her knees, spine against the wall, trembling like she might shatter at any second. She didn't have time to pray, only to lock the door as quietly as possible, but her hands shook so violently that the keys clicked and scraped, a sound that shot fear straight up her spine. She held her breath, begging the silence to hide her. The footsteps continued, passed by, grew distant, faded into the far end of the hall. Tessa exhaled in a wounded gasp, the sound of a drowning person finally surfacing for air. She pushed herself up and wiped her tears quickly. Julian had been very clear. 30 minutes, no delays. She put on her coat, tucked the bag beneath it as if hiding a secret that could save her life, then opened the door inch by inch, each tiny sound exploding inside her skull like a hammer strike. The hallway was empty. Tessa stepped out, closed the door, pulled the key from the lock, and began to move. Each step felt like crossing into a world she had never been allowed to touch for years. A world where she might escape him, escape the pain, escape everything. As she neared the emergency stairwell, she heard the front entrance open, the wind rushing in, and the sound of something dropped on the floor, making her flinch and press herself flat against the wall, one hand over her chest like trying to keep her heart from breaking free. But it wasn't Troy, just a neighbor. She hurried down the cold metal steps, gripping the railing with numb fingers, and when she reached the door leading to the back of the building, she grabbed the handle, trying not to shake, trying not to make a sound, trying to follow Julian's instructions exactly. She heard 3 knocks, precise. Tessa opened the door. A man in a black jacket stood there, eyes without curiosity, only firm resolve, like someone born to shield others. "Tessa Brooks?" he whispered. She nodded. "Move quickly, don't look back." She stepped out, feet barely touching the ground, palms slick with sweat. The black SUV's rear door opened. She climbed in, hugging the bag to her chest like it was her life. The door slammed shut, and for the first time Tessa fully heard the sound of a door closing behind her old life. The driver handed her a phone. "One call," he said. "Julian." Tessa brought the phone to her ear, breath cracking as it left her lips. "I'm in the car," she whispered. And only when she spoke the words out loud did she realize she was truly leaving that apartment behind. Julian's voice came through, low, deep, steady, and she felt as the car pulled out of the lot as though she were already somewhere safe. "Good job, Tessa. I'll take care of everything else. From now on, you don't have to be afraid anymore." Tessa pressed her face into her hands, tears falling like they had been waiting years for permission. She had run. She had survived. She had begun climbing out of hell. And all of it started with a small business card and a man who refused to sit still while a woman disappeared into darkness. The safe apartment sat inside a quiet building on the edge of the city, where car horns seemed to fade behind thick glass, and the soft yellow streetlight washed over the white walls. Clean to the point of feeling impersonal, strange enough that Tessa felt like she was walking into a world that didn't belong to her. A world where even the wind sounded gentler, where nothing carried Troy's scent anymore. And it was that very peace that made her chest tighten, as if she were trying to adjust to air. Her body had never learned how to breathe. Julian's man opened the door, switched on the lights, set the keys on the kitchen counter, and spoke in a voice light but firm, as if careful not to frighten her further. "You can stay here as long as you want. No one knows this apartment. No one is watching. No Troy." And those words, "no Troy," fell into Tessa's ears like something that both saved her and made her want to collapse. The door closed, leaving her alone in a perfectly still apartment. No heavy footsteps, no pounding on doors, no cursing, no threats barked in her name. Only silence. But instead of comforting her, that silence crashed into her chest like a cold wave flooding her lungs. She stood in the middle of the living room, gripping the strap of her bag, staring into nothing. And only seconds later, her whole body began to tremble. Not from cold, but from freedom arriving too suddenly. From her body not understanding that it had escaped a place that had nearly killed her the night before. From fear of losing its anchor and rolling into a snowball, fast and growing, squeezing her heart tight. Her breathing scattered. Her chest hurt. Her knees softened as if ready to buckle. She switched on another light. Brightness poured out, but it couldn't chase away the darkness wrapped around her mind. "It's okay. It's okay. It's okay," she whispered, but her voice trembled so hard the words sounded like they came from someone else's mouth. Tessa slid down to the floor, back against the wall, arms wrapped around her bruised arm, and the tears finally fell. Not loud, but heavy, dropping one by one as if her body could no longer hold itself together now that it understood she wasn't going to die today. It was her first panic attack in freedom, not from fear of being hit, but from the vastness of a world no longer cushioned by the routines of pain. After a long, very long, while she stood up, washed her face, changed clothes, pulled her sleeves down to cover the bruises, and stared at a version of herself she wasn't sure she could trust. A girl who had just escaped hell but didn't know how to step into anything resembling heaven. She inhaled deeply and decided to go to the office where Julian was waiting. Parker Technologies' headquarters glowed under the late afternoon sun, the rows of maple trees outside casting long shadows across the steps. When Tessa entered the lobby, her eyes immediately dropped to the floor, her hand tightening around her bag strap to hide the trembling. She walked quickly, avoiding the guard's eyes, avoiding every passerby, as if anyone who looked long enough would see every wound beneath her sleeves. When she opened the glass door to the CEO's office wing, she froze for a single breath, trying to steady herself, trying to order her body not to shake, but she failed. "Come in." Julian's voice came from inside, low, gentle enough to make her heart stutter. Tessa stepped in, and the moment he saw her, Julian rose from his desk. He didn't rush toward her, didn't reach out. He only stood there, eyes widening just a fraction, enough to reveal the storm of emotions rising in him. Anger, pain, protectiveness, all woven together in those deep, warm brown eyes. Light from the window streaked across Tessa's face, and Julian saw clearly, clearer than at the restaurant, the bruise stretching from her cheek to her jawline, the faint blue and yellow marks on her wrist barely hidden by her sleeve, and her eyes, the eyes of someone who had lost more than she could ever speak aloud. He didn't ask, "Are you okay?" because he knew the answer would be a lie. He didn't ask, "What did he do to you?" because he knew the questions would make her shrink. Instead, he drew in a breath and asked, in a steady, low voice, chosen carefully so each word would land without hurting her, "What would you like to start with?" Tessa blinked. She didn't understand. Julian took a step toward her, but kept a safe distance, the kind a survivor needed. "This isn't about what I decide, or what the lawyer decides, or what anyone else decides except you." His voice was calm water, still and unwavering. "What do you want to do first? Eat, rest, meet the lawyer, or just sit here and breathe?" Tessa opened her mouth, but no sound came out. She had never been asked what she wanted. During the 2 years she lived with Troy, that question had been stripped from her life like a luxury she didn't deserve. I She tried to look up, but her gaze collided with Julian's, and instinct made her lower her eyes immediately. I, I really don't know. Julian nodded. He didn't try to lift her chin or force eye contact the way other men did. Not knowing is a choice too, and it's completely okay. A simple sentence. Yet Tessa felt her throat tighten, not painfully, but warmly. He walked around the desk, but not too close. He stood off to the side, giving her space. Tessa, from now on, everything we do goes at your pace. Not mine, not anyone else's. She nodded, eyes burning, and the thing that frightened her most was that she wasn't afraid of him. She couldn't meet Julian's gaze because it made her chest ache in a strange way. Yet she felt safe standing within a few meters of him. She couldn't face the eyes of most men, but Julian's gaze wasn't like theirs. It didn't dissect. It didn't strip her down. It didn't demand. It felt like a place to lean if she ever chose to. I want, Tessa whispered, her voice thin as a thread, to sit down. Just sit for a bit. Julian nodded and stepped aside, creating a wide space around the chair. Then we'll start with that. And for the first time in months, Tessa sat in a chair without fearing someone would yank her hair, slap her, or kick her to the floor. Julian watched her, his eyes softening until her heart squeezed. And he thought quietly that if he could, he would spend his whole life proving to her that not every man would hurt her. Dr. Kim's therapy office sat on the 7th floor of a quiet building, with large glass windows collecting every drop of the late afternoon light, and Tessa stepped inside like someone who had just walked through a storm and still couldn't believe she had reached the shore. Her hands clutched the bag straps so tight her knuckles turned white, her eyes refusing to meet anyone else's, as if a single glance might be enough to shatter her. Dr. Kim greeted her with a voice as gentle as a leaf touching the surface of water. Hello, Tessa. You don't have to say anything right away. We'll start whenever you're ready. That voice, warm, steady, never rushing, made Tessa's throat tighten for a reason she couldn't name. She sat down in the corner of the sofa, curling into herself like she needed to protect every vulnerable part of her from the very light in the room. For a long moment, the only sound was the clock ticking one beat at a time into the air. Then Dr. Kim spoke. You can tell me about the thing that hurt you the most, if you want. Tessa looked down at her hands and saw a faint purple mark on her left wrist. The reminder of the night Troy squeezed hard enough for the blood to feel like it might burst. And maybe that was the final crack in her defenses. She drew in a slow breath and spoke. Not smoothly, not strong, but with a trembling voice like a child confessing something terrible. There was this time he kicked the cabinet when he was mad, Tessa began, eyes fixed on the floor like the story didn't belong to her. The cup shattered, and the glass cut my leg. A swallow that felt like choking. There was a lot of blood. I couldn't stand up, but he didn't take me to the hospital. He just told me I deserved it for making him lose control. Dr. Kim didn't interrupt, didn't widen her eyes, didn't look shocked. She only nodded slowly, like the act of Tessa saying it out loud was already a rare kind of victory. Tessa continued, I knew it was wrong, but afterward he held me. He kissed the bruises. He said he loved me so much he couldn't help himself. And I believed him. Her voice cracked. She covered her mouth as if she'd spoken too loudly. I thought if I tried harder, be softer, quieter, more careful, he'd stop. I thought it was my fault. A tear fell onto her jeans, blooming into a small dark spot like ink spreading through water. Dr. Kim, why didn't I leave earlier? Why did I stay? Why was I so stupid? She cried like paper tearing, not loud but so painfully that it filled the room with a sharp ache. Dr. Kim placed a box of tissues near her hand, but not too close, so Tessa could reach for it herself. Tessa, she said, slow and certain, you didn't leave because you were weak. Weak people don't survive years of abuse. You stayed because your trust in yourself had been destroyed. People who are abused don't leave because they think they deserve it, because they think they can't survive without that person, because they are isolated, gaslit, convinced no one will believe them. Tessa felt her throat close again, like invisible fingers squeezing tight. But you are not useless, Dr. Kim continued, voice growing warmer. It isn't your fault when someone chooses violence. It isn't your fault when you hope for love. It isn't your fault when you believe in apology. Good people often stay too long, not because they are weak, but because they love deeply. A tiny broken sob escaped Tessa's chest before she could stop it. She buried her face in her hands, breathing hard, her shoulders shaking. I'm scared. Her voice was rough, scraped raw. I'm scared I'll never be normal again, that I won't be able to trust anyone, that I'm too broken. Dr. Kim shook her head gently. No one becomes broken by surviving. You are not broken, Tessa. You are learning how to live again after being suffocated for too long. Warm silence settled between them, thick enough to hold her together. Tessa exhaled, and for the first time it wasn't trembling. The session lasted 60 minutes, but to Tessa it felt like a doorway opening into a world she had never known. A world where the blame wasn't hers, where tears weren't mocked, where pain wasn't dismissed. When she stepped out of the room, her eyes were still red, but her breath felt deeper, lighter, like she had finally dropped a boulder she'd carried inside her chest. Julian was waiting in the hallway, holding 2 cups of coffee, one hot, one iced. Not knowing which one she'd want, too afraid to ask because he didn't want to frighten her. When he saw her, he stood quickly, but he didn't step forward like most men would. He kept a careful distance, not close enough to corner her, just close enough so she wouldn't feel alone. All done. His voice was as gentle as the latte in his hand. Tessa nodded, her fingers instinctively tugging her sleeve longer to hide the bruise. Julian noticed, but he didn't ask, didn't stare. He simply rotated the hot cup slightly toward her. Hot coffee wash if you want. A beet. Or iced. Your choice. Just one simple sentence. But it made Tessa feel like she was allowed to choose. A tiny thing she hadn't had the right to do for 2 years. She chose the hot one. Her hands shook as she took it. Not from fear, but from the quiet shock of being treated with care. They walked side by side, not touching, not rushing, not saying much. Just Julian's silent presence like a soft shield between her and the world. Tessa couldn't look directly into his eyes, but she felt safe walking beside him. Safe hearing his footsteps steady next to hers. Safe knowing that even without a hand on her, she wasn't alone. And sometimes for someone who just escaped hell, that alone is a miracle. 3 weeks after her first therapy session, when Tessa's breathing had finally begun to steady in the new mornings, when she had grown used to seeing herself in the mirror without flinching because she no longer expected Troy's reflection standing behind her, Julian appeared at the doorway of her small office with a kind of hesitation she had never seen on him before, as if he were holding something fragile, something that could bolt if he spoke too loudly. There's a fundraising gala tonight, he said, his voice low and careful, as though he feared adding pressure. For the Inner Healing Support Fund, the one that helped my mother, I thought, you might enjoy going, but only if you want to. Tessa looked up, a bit surprised, not by the invitation, but by the way he said it, by the space he left between his words, as if giving her every opportunity to decline. Something far too unfamiliar for someone who had lived under a rule where there was always only one correct answer. She nodded slowly. I want to try. Double asterisk. The dressing room in the safe apartment was so quiet that Tessa could hear her own heartbeat as she stood before the mirror wearing the open-back blue gown. Lauren from HR had helped her choose that blue. Deep as an ocean at night, soft as flowing water. Wrapped around her body in a way that felt both flattering and tender. Not flashy, but beautiful enough that she had to look twice to believe the woman in the mirror was her. Her back was almost fully bare, something she hadn't even dared think about 6 months ago. Troy had once sneered that a bare back made men look at you like meat on a plate, a sentence that forced her into high-necked, long-sleeve clothes for 2 years. But tonight, as she pulled the zipper up, the most unexpected part was that she didn't feel afraid. Or rather, the fear no longer swallowed her whole. It lingered, faint as a shadow under her feet, but it was no longer the master of her life. And what made her feel stronger was the thought that Julian would look at her and not see meat on a plate, not see something to possess, but see a person. Double asterisk. When Tessa stepped into the hotel lobby where the gala was being held, golden light, champagne glasses, violin music, every sound seemed to fall away from her. Julian stood near the entrance, adjusting his cuff, looking like he had stepped out of a magazine cover, but carrying a kind of quiet that didn't overwhelm the room. And when he turned and saw her, that look. God, that look. It wasn't the look men gave when they saw a beautiful woman, not the crude admiration she had been forced to endure, not the ordinary flicker of surprise. He looked at her as if she were something sacred, as if he were witnessing something he respected too much to breathe too hard around, something so rare that it tightened her chest, making her want to step back and forward at the same time. Tessa, he said her name so softly, as if he wasn't sure she was real. She lowered her head, her face warming, but her heart, for the first time after so many nights of living not living, beat not out of fear, but because she felt seen. Double asterisk. The gala unfolded under soft conversations and warm lighting reflected off satin-draped tables. The speeches about recovery, about hope, about the doors that had opened for people once trapped in darkness. Each word touched Tessa in ways she didn't know how to process. Julian never drifted more than a few steps away, not clinging, but always close enough that if she faltered, all she'd need to do was turn slightly to find those deep, night-sea eyes watching her, quietly telling her, "I'm here." They spoke with other guests, but every time their eyes met accidentally, a small spark, light and hesitant, like a newborn flame, jumped between them. Double asterisk. And then the slow music began. The violin notes stretched out into soft threads, weaving the air with warmth. Julian leaned toward her, his voice low enough to belong only to her. "Would you like to dance for a bit? Only if you want to." Tessa swallowed, her hand trembling, not from dislike, but from memories. Troy had always forced her to dance, his grip bruising her waist, his mouth pressed to her ear, whispering threats dressed as affection. But this wasn't Troy. This wasn't violence wrapped in love. I want to try," she whispered. Julian extended his hand, but didn't touch her. He simply offered it, waiting for her to place her own hand in his. A small detail, but to Tessa, it was an entire universe of difference. She placed her hand in his, lightly, like setting her heart on a shoulder she wasn't sure she could bear it. They stepped onto the dance floor. The lights softened to velvet. The music moved like water, and Julian placed one hand on her waist, very gently, very carefully, as though even the brush of wind against her might hurt her. But Tessa's body, shaped by years of violence, reacted instantly, tightening like an overwound string. Her whole frame stiffened, her breath fractured, and her eyes went wide. And Julian, instead of pushing her to adjust, instead of pretending not to notice, stepped back. Immediately, not a beat late, he withdrew his hand from her waist as if pulling away from a flame. "I'm sorry," he said quietly, and the darkness in his eyes came not from offense, but sorrow, for a wound he could see but could never fully understand. "I didn't want to scare you." Tessa shook her head. "It's not you. It's just, I'm not used to it yet." Julian nodded slowly, his gaze warm as the glow of a yellow lamp in a cold room. "Then we'll just stand like this," he said, keeping a safe distance. "No touching, no pressure, just listening to the music. Only when you feel safe." That sentence, not romantic, not sweet, made her heart slam against her ribs like a door swinging open. Because for the first time in years, a man didn't measure her worth by how much unwanted touch she could endure. For the first time, someone stepped back because she was afraid, rather than stepping forward to silence her. For the first time, she was the one who got to choose. Tessa drew in a long breath. The melody drifted. Julian stood before her, hands at his sides, gaze steady, his breathing slowing, as if trying to sync with hers. And after a long moment, it was she, not him, who moved closer by half a step. Not touching, just nearer. And Julian, with all the gentleness she had never been given in her life, smiled slightly. It was the first moment, soft, fragile but real, when something between them began to glow. Not a fierce spark that burned everything, but a small, warm light deep in the chest, enough to know that from here, something beautiful could begin. It had been nearly 3 weeks since Tessa started working in the cold, bright office of Parker Technologies. 3 weeks learning how to breathe again among the steady clacking of keyboards. 3 weeks trying to believe that the world could be quieter than the one she once knew. 3 weeks for her body to stop flinching whenever someone walked too quickly behind her. 3 weeks for her mind to learn that the sound of a door opening didn't always mean someone was about to explode. And 3 weeks to accept that there were places where men didn't scream in her face, but spoke in calm, measured tones. Tessa was focused on her weekly report, adjusting a few numbers in the timeline chart, trying to let herself sink into the rhythm of work, when the soft ding of the elevator sounded at the end of the hallway. A small sound, like every other day. She looked up, and the blood inside her turned to ice. Troy! He stood there right in the middle of the 15th floor lobby, breathing hard, jaw locked tight like he had run straight from hell to get here. A gray hoodie, red eyes, his cheek is twitching. He scanned the room, and his gaze landed on Tessa with the precision of a predator recognizing prey that dared escape. Tessa's entire body froze. How did he get in? Security had his photo. The 15th floor required a key card. Impossible. Impossible. But he was standing right there, and that cruel smirk, the one that haunted her for 2 years, curled at the corner of his mouth. I knew it, Troy said, his voice low, gravelly, poisonous like acid. I knew you'd sneak off and get a job. I knew you couldn't leave me. An employee nearby stepped back, startled. Another grabbed their phone to call security, but everything happened too slowly. Troy lunged. Before Tessa could stand, he had already grabbed her wrist. Squeezing so hard she heard something crack like skin being torn from the inside. Pain shot up her arm, blinding and sharp. Tessa! Julian's voice came from his office, muffled, distant, like underwater. You think you can run? You know how hard I looked for you? Troy yanked her from the chair. You thought I'd just let you go? But please stop. Troy, Shut up. His grip tightened. Tessa's entire arm burned, red-purple blotches blooming fast like her blood was being forced into a single trapped space. Julian appeared in her line of sight, not running, not yelling, but moving quickly, sharply, every muscle pulled tight like steel wire. He stepped between them, a wall Troy could not break through. I already told you, Julian said, voice low, each word cutting like a blade. Let her go. Troy scoffed. Oh, look at the big tech CEO trying to act like a man. No, Julian replied, eyes dark and merciless. I'm the man who will drag you out of this building in handcuffs if you don't release her right now. It wasn't a threat, it was a verdict. 2 security guards rushed in at that moment, grabbed Troy and pulled him back, but he still jerked on Tessa's arm one last time before they restrained him. So hard the skin went bright red and veins bulged beneath her wrist. Traitor! Troy screamed as they dragged him away. You're mine! Mine! The elevator doors closed. He disappeared. But Tessa didn't hear the elevator shutting, didn't hear security muttering reassurances, didn't hear co-workers murmuring in shock. She only heard her own heartbeat, wild, crashing, smashing against her ribs like it was trying to break free. She collapsed into the chair, the biggest panic attack of the story so far. Tessa! Julian dropped to one knee, but stayed 2 steps away, careful not to overwhelm a nervous system stretched to its breaking point. She clutched her head, breath fractured into pieces, chest tightening as if an invisible fist was crushing her lungs. No, no, please don't! She repeated the words in terror, eyes wide but seeing nothing. Julian recognized it instantly, a severe panic response. He lowered his voice to a whisper, soothing, grounding. Tessa, listen to me. You're not with him. You're at work. I'm right here. No one is touching you. Her trembling worsened. He extended his hand toward the floor, not touching her, but placing it where she could see it if she lifted her gaze. Breathe with me, slowly. In, 1, 2, 3, hold, and breathe out, gently, he repeated, patient, steady as a fortress. I'm here, keep going. Breathe in. That's it. Good. Tessa's breath began to return, slow, uneven, but present. When her eyes finally flicked upward, Julian saw something that stabbed straight through him. She was bracing for a hit, waiting for a slap, expecting to be thrown to the floor. And Julian, heart splitting open inside him, could only say one thing. Let me take you home. She didn't ask which home. She only nodded, trembling. Julian opened the car door for her, moving slowly, never once touching her shoulder. As the car rolled forward, Tessa stared blankly out the window, her mind trapped on the memory of Troy's hand crushing her wrist. Julian didn't say, "You're okay." He knew she wasn't. He just spoke one sentence, soft as a hand laid gently over a wounded heart. "You're safe with me." Tessa cried, not loud, not broken, but tears slipped down like raindrops trailing the car window. That night, the question that hurt Julian more than a knife. Back in the safe apartment, Tessa curled up on the sofa, arms wrapped around her bruised wrist. Julian set a warm compress, some painkillers, and a soft blanket on the table. He sat a full meter away, far enough not to trap her. "Tessa?" He spoke when he saw her shaking uncontrollably. "Do you want me to stay here with you?" She nodded, a tiny nod, like she was afraid someone would take away her right to choose. He slid slightly closer, still respecting the safe distance. Long minutes passed before she whispered, "Julian?" "I'm right here." She lifted her eyes, red and swollen, fists clenching her shirt, and asked a question that made his chest drop like a stone. "If one day you get angry, will you hit me?" Julian closed his eyes for a second, not because he was offended, but because he could see just how deep the damage inside her ran. He faced her fully, speaking slowly, each word laid down like an oath he would never take back. "No, not today, not tomorrow, not any day in my lifetime." Tessa broke, and for the first time since meeting him, she leaned into his shoulder, trembling, afraid, but finding a patch of warmth to finally rest her heart. Julian held still for a breath. Then he wrapped an arm around her, light, warm, not possessive, the embrace of someone keeping her safe, not claiming her. And that night, with Tessa's shaky breaths and the soft silence of the room surrounding them, Julian knew one thing for certain. He would never let that past lay a hand on her again. 3 weeks had passed since the day Troy broke into Parker Technologies. 3 weeks during which, on the surface, Tessa's life seemed steadier. She returned to the office, finished her work on time, ate proper meals, and slept more hours. But inside, her body still trembled whenever the elevator chimed. Her mind still jolted at the sound of fast male footsteps behind her. And her heart still kicked against her ribs every time she spotted a hoodie at the corner of a street. Julian, understanding this more clearly than anyone else, walked with her every morning and picked her up every afternoon, not hovering, not controlling, just existing beside her like a wall she could lean on if needed. Then on a cold Thursday morning, Julian's lawyer, Mrs. Kingston, a sharp woman whose eyes knew exactly what justice looked like, set a file on the table and said, "It's time, Tessa. We have enough evidence, and you can take him to court." The room fell quiet. Tessa placed her hand on the file, feeling the paper warm beneath her palm. "Can I win?" Her voice was small, as if afraid hope might grow too large and collapse on itself. Mrs. Kingston looked straight into her eyes as though transferring strength through her gaze. "Just tell the truth. The truth will handle the rest." Tessa nodded slowly. She wasn't sure she was strong enough, but she knew she didn't want to run anymore. Double asterisk. On the morning of the trial, the cold was sharp enough to turn every breath into mist. Tessa walked across the courthouse steps, clutching the hem of her coat, feeling as though each step pressed down into thin ice. One wrong move, and everything could shatter. Julian walked beside her, hands tucked in his coat pockets, but each time she wavered, he gently leaned toward her, as if ready to catch her without closing the distance she wasn't ready to cross. Inside the courtroom, the air was heavy like a damp blanket. Troy sat in the defendant's row, dressed in a crisp white shirt as if trying to prove he was respectable. But the way he slouched back, the curl of his lip made all that white fabric meaningless. Tessa didn't look at him. She couldn't. But when she stepped onto the witness stand, she knew she had to face him eventually. Mrs. Kingston's questions were soft, guiding, not pushing. Tessa, could you tell us when it first began? Tessa inhaled deeply, not the steady breath of someone strong, but the breath of someone about to re-enter the dark room where she had once been trapped. He started the first time, right after we moved in together. Her voice trembled. She heard it herself. Behind her, Troy let out a mocking laugh, sharp as a knife tapping glass. Go on, sweetheart, he sneered. And don't forget the part about sneaking around with the rich CEO. People in the courtroom turned to look. Tessa gripped the edge of the stand. Mrs. Kingston objected. The judge struck his gavel. But Troy's laugh had already wrapped around every old wound, tightening like a fist around her throat. Julian's hand balled into a fist on his knee, his eyes darkening, but he held himself back. Not because he didn't want to break that smirk, but because he knew Tessa needed him steady more than she needed him angry. Mrs. Kingston stepped closer, her voice firm as steel. Tessa, you may continue. After several breaths that barely made it through her chest, Tessa continued haltingly. He hit me when I didn't answer the phone fast enough, when I cried, when I laughed, when I asked a question he didn't like. Her breath cracked, her fingers dug into the stand. One time, he kicked the cabinet in the kitchen, the glass shattered, shards cut into my leg. He let me bleed on the floor and told me I deserved it. Whispers rippled through the room. Troy chuckled. Oh, poor thing. You talk like you did nothing wrong. Silence, the judge barked. Tessa shut her eyes, tears spilling faster than she could catch them. I stayed because I thought it was my fault. I thought he would change. I thought if I stayed quiet enough, he would stop. She opened her eyes and for the first time, she looked at Troy. Not because she wanted to, but because she needed to. Troy leaned forward. You left me for that rich guy, didn't you? And something inside Tessa, small, glowing, like a candle lit in a dungeon, flickered to life. She straightened her back and said, her voice no longer shaking, So I didn't leave you because someone else had more money. The room fell silent. Her voice cracked, but was clear. I left because if I stayed, I would die. No one moved. No one breathed. The courtroom sank into a silence heavy as ash. Only Julian, in that silence, leaned forward slightly as if trying to steady her heart from across the room. Double asterisk. When the judge returned after deliberation, Tessa gripped her coat sleeve, feeling like she stood on the edge of a cliff. The judge read the charges. Each line cut another thread tying her to the darkness. Assault with intent to harm. Unlawful entry. Credible threat to the victim's life. Physical assault recorded on Parker Technologies premises. And finally, the defendant, Troy Morgan, found guilty. Tessa didn't hear the exact sentence, didn't hear the number of years, didn't hear who patted whose shoulder. She only heard something crack open inside her, not breaking, but unlocking. Her knees weakened. Julian, who had spent the entire trial sitting just behind her like a final line of defense, immediately stood and stepped forward. She turned and then she fell. Not collapsing, but falling into his arms like someone who had finally reached shore after drowning for too long. Julian wrapped her in his arms like she was the most precious thing he'd ever held. One hand on the back of her head, the other around her waist, not squeezing too tightly but holding firmly enough to tell her no one on earth would ever again touch her with pain. Tessa sobbed into his chest, tears mixing relief, exhaustion, old hurt, and new hope. It's over, Tessa, Julian whispered against her ear, his voice shaking just slightly, as if he too could barely contain his emotion. He can't touch you anymore. Not ever again. And for the first time in a very long time, Tessa truly believed it. After the trial, neither of them asked, "What are we now?" No one signed any kind of agreement, but Tessa and Julian slipped into mornings together, evenings together, quiet moments full of trust, and eventually both realized they were dating, were in love, were stepping into something too beautiful to call by any old name. Their earliest dates weren't in fancy restaurants, but at a small cafe down the block, where Tessa loved the smell of fresh waffles, and Julian always ordered a hot latte with no sugar, simply because he knew she hated the scent of burnt sweetness. They walked side by side, shoulders brushing lightly like two stars rediscovering their correct orbit. Neither rushing nor clinging, just letting their bodies relearn what it meant to walk beside someone warm without fearing danger. And then one evening when a soft breeze drifted across the balcony of the safe apartment, while they stood overlooking the city lights, the golden glow making Tessa look like something delicate and fierce all at once, Julian leaned in slightly and asked, voice so low his breath practically whispered against her ear, "Can I come a little closer?" Tessa didn't answer with words. She took half a step toward him, and for Julian, that was louder than any yes. His breath hovered near her neck, not touching, only close enough to make her heart race, yet far enough to remind her she was in control. Their shoulders touched and Tessa trembled, but it wasn't fear. It was that warm, startling rush spreading from that small point of contact all the way into her bones. Julian lifted his hand, slowly, gently, hesitating as if asking every inch of her skin whether it agreed. When his hand paused at her hip, he held just lightly. Light enough that she could step away in an instant if she wanted, but firm enough for her to feel held without being trapped. "Tessa, if you don't want—" She looked up, and for the first time since they met, Tessa was the one to move first. Her fingers touched the collar of his shirt, tugged ever so slightly, and her lips brushed his, like a breath she had waited years to release. The kiss wasn't forceful, wasn't hungry, wasn't fiery, but it burned so deeply Julian had to place a hand behind her neck to keep her close, not to possess, just to make sure he didn't pull away too soon. Their breaths mingled. Tessa's chest trembled with each new heartbeat, learning that warmth didn't have to coexist with pain. Julian kissed her with a gentleness that scorched, as if each touch of his lips could erase one invisible wound inside her. When the kiss finally broke, she leaned her forehead to his, exhaling, her eyes gleaming like she had just crossed a new threshold in her life. "I'm not afraid when you touch me," she murmured, breath brushing his mouth. "For the first time, I'm not afraid." Julian closed his eyes as if he were swallowing the entire universe. "I'll only touch you when you want me to. Only when you invite me closer. Only when you feel safe." She kissed him again, deeper this time, warmer, like a full answer. That night they slept together for the first time, not to have sex, not to stake a claim, not to prove anything. They simply slept, and to Tessa, that alone was sacred. Julian lay near the edge of the bed, his arm resting loosely behind her back, not touching, silently asking, "May I hold you?" Tessa turned. She moved into his arms. She rested her head on his chest like the steady heartbeat of a safe man was the only lullaby she had ever needed. "Can you hold me?" she asked, not out of fear, but to be sure. Julian wrapped his arms around her, slow, warm, pulling her close only enough for her to know he was there, protecting her, grounding her, soothing her. No desire, no urgency, no demands. Just an embrace where she could finally breathe peacefully after so many years in the dark. Tessa fell asleep in those arms, the first night in years without nightmares, and Julian, watching her sleep, gently brushed a strand of hair from her cheek and thought to himself that if anything in this world deserved to be held with absolute tenderness, passion without rushing, it was her. The trail leading to Ridgefield Peak wasn't the kind of place most people chose for a proposal morning, but for Julian, it held something sacred. This was where he used to bring his mother every weekend so she could learn how to breathe again after years of being abused by his father. Where the two of them had stood beneath the open sky and taught themselves that past pain could not climb this high. Where the wind moved through the pines like invisible hands soothing wounds that hadn't yet healed. And today he brought Tessa here, the woman he loved with all the gentleness he had learned from watching his mother rise after violence. The trail was damp with morning mist, rocks glittering with droplets, the dark pines forming a natural canopy overhead. Tessa walked beside him, breath steady, but her eyes brightening every time she glanced at him, as if every moment with Julian was proof that love didn't have to come wrapped in fear. "I didn't think I'd like hiking," she said with a small smile, pulling her jacket closer. "I know," Julian murmured, "but this place, it's where I watched someone I loved most in the world learn to live again. I hoped it could be a place for you, too." Tessa looked at him a moment longer than usual. Something warm bloomed slowly, quietly in her chest. They continued until the trees opened up and the sky burst into a deep, vivid blue of late morning. Ridgefield Peak stretched before them, the lake below reflecting the sun like a sheet of gold. Wind lifting Tessa's hair and letting it fall again, as if sketching a soft painting around her. Tessa turned to smile at him, a smile so free she wouldn't have believed she could ever wear it just months earlier. Julian looked at her, too long, too softly, with too much love, with too much pride. Then he stepped closer, the shadows in his eyes deepening in the way only someone who loves profoundly can hold. "Tessa," he said gently. She turned, and for a heartbeat time stopped. Julian drew a deep breath, his gaze never leaving hers, and slowly knelt on the gray stone, one knee touching the earth in a silence that felt almost holy. Sunlight fell across his shoulders, and Tessa froze as if her heart had skipped a beat. "Julian." Her voice trembled, not from fear, but from the overwhelming beauty of what she sensed was coming. Julian looked up at her, his eyes filled with quiet conviction. "I love the person you're becoming, and I love the parts of you you're still stitching back together. No poetry, no theatrics, just truth, as simple as breath." Tessa lifted a hand to her mouth, tears glazing her eyes like tiny shards of glass in the sun. Julian continued, his voice dropping lower, so honest even the wind seemed to pause for it. "I don't love you because you're strong. I love you even when you're afraid, even when you tremble, even when you think you're not worthy of being loved." A long breath. "I love you because when you choose to stand up, you are the most beautiful thing I've ever seen." Tears spilled from Tessa's eyes, falling like drops, freed from years of suffocation. She inhaled, her voice cracking like a string under strain. "I'm afraid to love a man." A tight silence. "But I'm not afraid of you." Julian closed his eyes for a brief moment, as if a knot tied inside him for many years had just loosened. When he opened them again, the softest smile curved his lips. "Then, Tessa Brooks, would you spend the rest of your life learning how to love without fear? With me?" Tessa sobbed, a sound full-bodied, broken, and new. She rushed toward him, dropping to her knees, cupping his face as though she wanted to memorize every line of it. "I want to. Julian, I want to." He wrapped his arms around her, not tight but right, the embrace of a man who understood that love wasn't about holding hard, but holding true. And they kissed on that mountaintop, a kiss full of tears, breath, and unsaid vows. The kiss of two people once broken by their past, now finding each other at the highest point of the sky. 1 month later, the Tessa Brooks Resource Center, the support center for abuse survivors bearing her name, opened in a bright, spacious building, its glass walls catching the first light of morning. Tessa cut the ribbon with a smile that trembled but shone, while Julian stood backstage, eyes fixed on her, pride tightening his throat. On her first shift, the phone rang. Tessa picked it up. On the other end came frantic breathing, muffled crying. "I'm so scared. He's going to kill me. What do I do?" Tessa closed her eyes, letting her heart speak, in a calm, gentle voice, but one strengthened by someone who had stood in that very dark room. She said, "Listen, I've been exactly where you are." A soft breath. "You don't have to run alone. I'll help you." At the door, Julian leaned against the glass frame, watching her, tears gathering in his eyes but not falling, shimmering like sunlight on snow. He had never been so proud, Never loved so deeply. When the center quieted at the end of the day, Tessa stood alone by the large window. Dawn was rising in the distance, pale gold light spilling across rooftops, brushing her face. For the first time in her life, morning didn't make her feel small. Didn't make her fear the storm the day might bring. Didn't make her shrink. For the first time, truly, she felt free, strong, loved and loving someone worthy of her heart. And when Julian wrapped his arms around her from behind, pressed a soft kiss to her hair, she smiled, the smile of a woman who had walked through darkness and now stood firmly on her own feet. Tessa Brooks, at last, had come home to herself.